1971, President Richard Nixon, responding to widespread drug usage across America, announced what has often been called the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
This wasn't really a new thing, considering that Prohibition had attempted and, by most accounts, failed to crack down on alcohol consumption in the early 1900s.
Now, 100 years after Prohibition, and right around 50 years after the start of the war on drugs, we can safely say that these attempts to crack down on alcohol and drugs didn't play out quite as planned. As one Twitter user put it, "Big congratulations to drugs for winning the war on drugs."
This sets the stage for modern times, where our collective relationship with drugs, alcohol, and other mind-altering controlled substances can seem to fluctuate wildly. On one hand, our culture often makes light of using something like alcohol or cigarettes excessively, whether it's drinking and playing music in Sea of Thieves, or a tongue-in-cheek song about coping through a bad relationship with cigarettes.
On the flip side, we know now more than we ever have that alcoholism is a powerful, often life-changing addiction, and that cigarettes are radioactive cancer sticks.
You want to buy some death sticks?
You don't want to sell me death sticks.
I don't want to sell you death sticks.
You want to go home and rethink your life.
I want to go home and rethink my life.
This doesn't even begin to cover the opioid crisis, where drugs, often medically prescribed, are being misused and misappropriated, where according to the FDA, there's enough fentanyl in circulation for every American to overdose. The reality is that these are often dangerous substances, with some more dangerous than others. As Black Thought puts it,
real drugs do real things, go to extremes, crash regimes and kill kings. In the last reprieve, he still sings how the task that the master needs reveals wings. And though he has to bleed, it still brings him heaven and hell. Better believe the truth stings. Tying his arm off with violent strings, his eyes and dreams diverted as the siren screams eternal. Overdosage is a marketing scheme that's just as dark as it seems when it's a part of your team. With the esteem of a savant, as smart as a genius, vanity carried the dope into the heart of a fiend.
In this episode, we're going to discuss drug addiction. To begin, we need to understand what we mean when we say drug. If you type drug into Google, it gives the definition, a medicine or other substance which has a physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body.
This definition means a drug can range from a cup of coffee to ibuprofen to heroin. This may cause a question to arise. What makes a drug bad? Let's stop and discuss this for a minute. With the people around you, answer two questions. Is there a drug that is always good for you? Is there a drug that is always bad for you?
The answers might be more complicated than you might think. Coffee or caffeine seems like a decent answer for something that isn't the worst for you, but we all know that person who can't seem to function without coffee.
Please, Luke. Please, please, please.
How many cups have you had this morning?
None.
Plus?
5, but yours is better.
You have a problem.
Yes, I do.
And on the other side of things, it doesn't seem like meth or heroin is ever going to be a good idea. And yes, that's true. Taking meth or heroin casually for no purpose is not very smart. But oddly enough, there are times methamphetamines and opioids, which is what heroin is, are used for medical purposes. For a long time, people used Sudafed, a cold medicine, to make meth. And heroin is derived from morphine, an opioid-based painkiller, similar to others like OxyContin, Vicodin, Demerol, and the big one, fentanyl, which is roughly 50 times stronger than heroin.
Which makes a question bubble to the surface. Is this okay? Not everybody gets addicted to coffee or their painkillers after surgery, but some people do. And that should be enough to warrant a pause. Dr. Francis Collins explains opioid addiction bluntly.
This is something where one really needs to understand the diabolical way that this particular set of compounds rewires the brain in order to appreciate how those who become addicted really are in a circumstance where they can no more just by the free will decision get free of the addiction than you could get free of being needing to eat or drink. This has become a absolutely compelling drive that will cause people to do things that you can't imagine is good judgment, but it is overwhelming in the need. We also need to recognize, because I think some people who've not paid attention to this epidemic assume that this is people who just started on injectable heroin. 80% of the people who are currently addicted to opioids, many of which are now injectors, started with prescription drugs.
And this takes us back to some of the mixed messages we hear about drugs, especially from music and TV shows and games. Wanting to do meth isn't the right takeaway from a show like Breaking Bad, but throw a dart at a modern hip-hop song and you'll probably hear something glorifying drug culture, even to the point where it becomes extremely unhealthy or even dangerous.
And we're familiar with the extreme dangers of these drugs and addiction, as we've seen the tragedy of artists like DMX, Juice WRLD, and Michael K. Williams dying from overdoses. This trend of tragedy is not new, considering huge artists of the past like Elvis Presley, Judy Garland, and Marilyn Monroe also died due to complications related to drugs. These are tragedies in their own right, but they should make us take note of what is happening, not only with drug addiction, but also compulsive addictive behaviors in general.
And this should invite us to reflect on the types of substances we're putting into our bodies. We have to return to the idea that just because something feels good doesn't mean it is good for us. Let's pause for a second time and ask another question. What's something that feels good and is good for you? Share your answers with the people around you.
Maybe you said something like exercise, or playing music, or hanging out with friends. And our answers might change as we grow, and they might look different than other people's answers. But it's important to identify those things and celebrate them. When things that are destructive feel good, it's pretty confusing, and it can be hard to make wise choices. If we've already built up a repertoire of things we know are good for us, we're less likely to walk down those unhealthy paths. We need to develop our self-awareness.
Think about it this way. If we're under the legal age for drinking or smoking, we should be thinking about how we want to approach those things when we can legally partake. Many people can have a glass of wine and it's no problem, but some people might really struggle with that. Just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's good for us. This becomes even more important as more and more of the US legalizes a particularly popular drug, marijuana.
Do you know what this is?
Yes, it's marijuana.
How do you know that?
It's labeled.
That is Northern Lights cannabis indica.
No. It's marijuana.
And this takes us to one of the most important aspects of drug addiction. Drugs across the board affects our brains. And as our brains are developing, especially during the critical years, birth through teenage years, our brains are more susceptible to addiction.
We talked last episode about how dopamine, the feel-good chemical, is a big part of this. Drugs will introduce more dopamine into our brain, giving us a feeling of euphoria, a high feeling. This ranges from blackout drunkenness or numbness, like in the case of painkillers, to elevated states of energy and excitement, like you would see from caffeine or something stronger like a methamphetamine. We can get addicted to this good feeling, the dopamine, and we can also get addicted to the actual substance itself.
And if our brains are developing while an addiction is present, it can be harder to break that addiction. It's almost like putting a handprint of addiction in the wet cement of our brains. Buzzed, a book about drugs written by 3 doctors from Duke University, explains it specifically with alcohol this way. People who start drinking in their early to mid-teens are far more likely to develop alcohol dependency and to experience recurring episodes of dependency than are people who start drinking at age 21 or older.
This is why it's important to be aware of how drugs are portrayed and talked about. If we pause for a second to talk about vaping, which yes, we need to talk about vaping. One of the biggest issues with vaping early on was first how untested it was, and second how heavily it was marketed toward young people.
Hello America, I'm Matt Stool, CEO of Juul, the makers of America's favorite electronic cigarettes. We've recently come under fire for our advertisements targeting young children, and as the face of this company, I just want to tell you, we are so sorry. We would never market to the developing brains of America's future, because bottom line, that's what children are. They're our future. So, as a special apology, we would like to issue all Juul users a free pack of our expanded flavors. That means you get Cherry Berry Unicorn, Blue Raspberry Rainbow, and Minecraft.
In fact, both in practice, marketing, and arguably in health risks, vaping is similar to cigarettes. For a long time, cigarettes were heavily marketed towards young people, and we know this marketing worked because for a long time, everyone smoked.
Playing tag with the waves, a refreshing way to take a walk at the beach. How can you add to it? With a menthol cigarette.
It was also presented as an attractive hobby, which began to influence people based on their fear of missing out. It plays on the fear of not being accepted. And one of the easiest ways to find acceptance is by going along with the crowd and doing what others are doing, even if we don't really want to. We'll return to a lot of these ideas when we talk about social media in a later episode.
But to conclude, when it comes to drug addiction or really any compulsive behavior, it's easy to give up on ourselves. Addiction wears on us, telling us that we're not valuable, that we're bad and will always be that way, that we're hopeless. It can feel like nothing will ever change, and we should just give up any hope of a day where vaping or drinking or numbing won't be a motivating factor in our lives. That will never be better.
Does it ever get any different for people like us?
I don't think so. Nothing around us changes. Maybe if we work really hard, then maybe we become different. And then maybe at least it feels different. I don't know.
Used to becoming different people.
Good night, Joe.
Night, Riley.
This is where the gospel of Jesus arrives in quiet glory. Jesus does not require us to conquer our addiction to be close to him. When Jesus walked the earth, he chased down the ones we might call hopeless. He chased them to the point where he frustrated the religious leaders of his day. The Gospel of Matthew records it like this: "And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners."
It's important to note what Jesus was doing to help heal the sick. It's what a physician does. He didn't want them to stay in a state of hopelessness like addiction, but he wanted to help lift them out. Jesus will never tire of his pursuit of sinners. He will never tire of his pursuit of us. We leave you with this encouragement from Dr. Taylor Worley. If we are exasperated with ourselves, we need to remember that God is not. God never tires or wishes to be rid of us. We may have worn out all patience with ourselves, but Christ still says, "Come to me." He longs to offer us his reassuring peace, his restful calm, and his quiet and confident trust.